joint enterprise. They had agreed by a tacit consent to a common conception of the world they desired as a world scientifically ordered, an immense organization of mature common sense, healthy and secure, gathering knowledge and power for creative adventures as yet beyond dreaming. They were prepared to think of the makers of the Avebury Dyke as their yesterday selves, of the Stone Age savages as a phase in their late childhood, and of this great world order Sir Richmond foresaw as a day where dawn was already at hand. And in such long perspectives, the states, governments, and institutions of today became very temporary looking and replaceable structures indeed. Both these two people found themselves thinking in this fashion with an unwanted courage and freedom because the other one had been disposed to think in this fashion before. So Richmond was still turning over in his mind the happy, mutual release of the imagination this chance companionship had brought about when he found himself back again at the threshold of the Old George. Section 4. Sir Richmond Hardy was not the only man who was thinking intently about Miss Grammont at that particular moment. Two gentlemen were coming towards her across the Atlantic, whose minds, it chanced, were very busily occupied by her affairs. One of these was her father, who was lying in his brass bed in his commodious cabin on the Hollandia, regretting his diminishing ability to sleep in the early morning now, even when he was in the strong and soothing air of mid-Atlantic, and thinking of Vivi because she had a way of coming into his mind when it was undefended. And the other was Mr. Gunter Lake, on the Megantic one day out from Sandy Hook, who found himself equally sleepless and preoccupied. And although Mr. Lake was a man of vast activities and complicated engagements, he was coming now to Europe for the express purpose of seeing Vivi, and having things out with her fully and completely because, in spite of all that had happened, she made such an endless series of delays in coming to America. Old Grammont, as he appeared upon the pillow of his bed by the light of a rose-shaded bedside lamp, was a small-headed, grey-haired gentleman with a wrinkled face and sunken brown eyes. Years of business experience, mitigated only by such exercise as the game of poker affords, had intensified an instinctive inexpressiveness. Under the most solitary circumstances, old Grammont was still inexpressive, and the face that stared at the ceiling of his cabin and the problem of his daughter might have been the face of a pickled head in a museum, for any indication it betrayed of the flow of thought within. He lay on his back, and his bent knees lifted the bedclothes into a sharp mountain. He was not even trying to sleep. Why, he meditated, had Vivi stayed on in Europe so much longer than she need have done? And why had Gunter Lake suddenly got into a state of mind about her? Why didn't the girl confide in her father at least about these things? What was afoot? She had thrown over Lake once, and it seemed she was going to turn him down again. Well, if she was an ordinary female person, that was a silly sort of thing to do. With her fortune and his, you could buy the world. But suppose she was not all ordinary female person. Her mother hadn't been ordinary anyhow, whatever else you call her, and no one could call Grammont's blood all ordinary fluid. Old Grammont had never had any delusions about Lake. If Lake's father hadn't been a big man, Lake never would have counted for anything at all. Suppose she did turn him down. In itself, that wasn't a thing to break her father's heart. What did matter was not whether she threw Lake over, but what she threw him over for. If it was because he wasn't man enough, well and good. But if it was for some other lover, some good-looking worthless impostor, some European title or such like folly. At the thought of a lover for Vivi, a sudden flood of anger poured across the old man's mind, behind the still mask of his face. It infuriated him even to think of Vivi, his little Vivi, his own girl, entertaining a lover, being possibly most shameful thought, in love, like some ordinary silly female sinking to kisses, to the deeds one could buy and pay for. His VV. The idea infuriated and disgusted him. He fought against it as a possibility. Once some woman in New York had ventured to hint something to him of some fellow, some affair with an artist, Caston. She had linked this Caston with Vivi's Red Cross nursing in Europe. Old Grammont had made that woman sorry she spoke. Afterwards, he had caused inquiries to be made about this Caston. Careful inquiries. It seems that he and Vivi had known each other. There had been something, but nothing that Vivi need be ashamed of. When old Grammont's inquiry had come back with his report, old Grammont had been very particular about that. At first, the fellow had not been very clear, rather muddled indeed as to how things were. No doubt he wanted to make out there was something, just to seem to earn his money. Old Grammont had struck the table sharply, and the eyes that looked out of his mask had blazed. "What have you found against her?" he had asked in a low, even voice. "Absolutely nothing, sir," said the agent, suddenly white to the lips. Old Grammont stared at his memory of that moment for a while. That affair was all right, quite all right. Of course it was all right, and also, happily, Caston was among the dead. But it was well her broken engagement with Lake had been resumed as though it had never been broken off. If there had been any talk, that fact answered it. And now that Lake had served his purpose, old Grammont did not care in the least if he was shelved. Vivi could stand alone. Old Grammont had got a phrase in his mind that looked like dominating the situation. He dreamt of saying to Vivi, "Vivi, I'm going to make a man of you, if you're man enough." That was a large proposition. It implied all sorts of things. It meant that she could care as little for philandering as a able young businessman. Perhaps someday, a long time ahead, she might marry. There wasn't much reason for it, but it might be she would not wish to be called a spinster. Take a husband, thought old Grammont, when I am gone, as one takes a butler, to make the household complete. In previous meditations of his daughter's outlook, old Grammont had found much that was very suggestive in the President of Queen Victoria. She had had no husband in the lord and master type, so to speak, but only a prince consort well in hand. Why shouldn't the Grammont heiress dominate her male belonging, if it came to that, in the same fashion? Why shouldn't one tie her up and tie the whole thing up so far as any male belonging was concerned, leaving VV in all other respects free? How could one do it? The speculative calm of the sunken brown eyes deepened. His thoughts went back to the white face of the private inquiry agent. Absolutely nothing, sir. What had the fellow thought of hinting? Nothing of that kind in Vivi's composition. Never fear. Yet it was a curious anomaly that while one had 1,000 ways of defending one's daughter and one's property against that daughter's husband, there was no power on earth by which a father could stretch his dead hand between that daughter and the undue influence of a lover, unless you tied her up for good and all, lover or none. One was left at the mercy of Vivi's character. I ought to see more of her, he thought. She gets away from me, just as her mother did. A man need not suspect his womankind, but he should know what they are doing. It's his duty, his protective duty to them. These companions, these Seifert women and so forth, were all very well in their way. There wasn't much they kept from you if you got them concerned and asked them intently. But a father's eye is better. He must go about with the girl for a time, watch her with other men, give her chances to talk business with him, and see if she took them. Vivi, I'm going to make a man of you. The phrase ran through his brain. The deep instinctive jealousy of the primordial father was still strong in old Grammont's blood. It would be pleasant to go about with her on his right hand in Paris, his girl, straight and lovely, desirable and unapproachable, above that sort of nonsense, above all other masculine subjugation. Vivi, I'm going to make a man of you. His mind grew calmer. Whatever she wanted in Paris would be hers. He'd just let her rip. They'd be like sweethearts together, he and his girl. Old Grammont dozed off in dreamland. Section 5. The imaginations of Mr. Gunter Lake, 2 days behind Mr. Grammont upon the Atlantic, were of a gentler, more romantic character. In them, Vivi was no longer a daughter in the fierce focus of a father's jealousy, but the goddess enshrined in a good man's heart. Indeed, the figure that limelight of the reverie fell upon was not Vivi at all, but Mr. Gunter Lake himself in his favourite role of the perfect lover. An interminable speech unfolded itself. I ask for nothing in return. I never worried you about that Caston business, and I never will. Married to me, you shall be as free as if you were unmarried. Don't I know, my dear girl, that you don't love me yet? Let that be as you wish. I want nothing you are not willing to give me, nothing at all. All I ask is the privilege of making life happy, and it shall be happy for you. All I ask, all I ask. Protect, guard, cherish. For to Mr. Gunter Lake it seemed there could be no lovelier thing in life than a wife, in name only, slowly warmed into a glow of passion by the steadfast devotion and the strength and wisdom of a mate at first despised. Until at last a day would come. My darling, Mr. Gunter Lake whispered to the darkness, my little girl, it has been worth the waiting. Section 6. Miss Grammont met Sir Richmond on the bureau of the Old George with a telegram in her hand. My father reported his latitude and longitude by wireless last night. The London people think he will be off to Falmouth in 4 days' time. He wants me to join his liner there and go on to Cherbourg and Paris. He's arranged that. He is the sort of man who can arrange things like that. There will be someone at Falmouth to look after us and put us aboard the liner. I must wire them where I can pick up a telegram tomorrow. Wells in Somerset, said Sir Richmond. His plans were already quite clear. He explained that he wanted her first to see Shaftesbury, a little old Wessex town that was 300 or 400 years older than Salisbury, perched on a hill, a Saxon town where Alfred had gathered his forces against the Danes, and where Canute, who had ruled over all Scandinavia and Iceland and Greenland, and had come near ruling a patch of America, had died. It was a little sleepy place now, looking out dreamily over beautiful views. They would lunch in Shaftesbury and walk round it. They would go in the afternoon through the pleasant West Country, where the Celts had prevailed against the old folk of the Stonehenge Temple, and the Romans against the Celts, and the Saxons against the Romanized Britons, and the Danes against the Saxons. A war-scarred landscape, abounding in dikes and entrenchments and castles, sunken now into the deepest peace. To Glastonbury, to see what was there to see of a marsh village the Celts had made for themselves 300 or 400 years before the Romans came. And at Glastonbury also there were the ruins of a great Benedictine church and abbey that had once rivaled Salisbury. Thence they would go on to Wells to see yet another great cathedral and to dine and sleep. Glastonbury Abbey and Wells Cathedral brought the story of Europe right up to Reformation times. That will be a good day for us, said Sir Richmond. It will be like turning over the pages of the history of our family to and fro. There will be nothing nearly so old as Avebury in it, but there will be something from almost every chapter that comes after Stonehenge. Rome will be poorly represented, but that may come the day after at Bath. And the next day too I want to show you something of our old River Severn. We will come right up to the present if we go through Bristol. There we shall have a whiff of America, our new find, from which the tobacco comes, and we shall be reminded of how we set sail thither. Was it yesterday or the day before? You will understand at Bristol how it is that the energy has gone out of this dreaming land to Africa and America and the whole wide world. It was the good men of Bristol, by the by, with their trade from Africa to America, who gave you your colour problem. Bristol we may go through tomorrow, and Gloucester, mother of I don't know how many American Gloucesters. Bath will get in somehow, and then, as Anglo-American showman, I shall be tempted to run you northward a little way past Tewkesbury, just to go into a church here and there, and show you monuments bearing little shields with the stars and stripes upon them, a few stars and a few stripes, the Washington family monuments. It was not only from England that America came, said Miss Grammont. But England takes an American memory back most easily and most fully to Avebury and the Baltic Northmen, past the emperors and the Corinthian columns that smothered Latin Europe. For you and me, anyhow, this is our past. This was our childhood, and this is our land. He interrupted, laughing as she was about to reply. Well, anyhow, he said, it is a beautiful day and a pretty country before us with the ripest history in every grain of its soil. So we'll send a wire to your London people and tell them to send their instructions to Wells. I'll tell Belinda, she said, to be quick with her packing. Section 7. As Miss Grammont and Sir Richmond Hartley fulfilled the details of his excellent programme and revised their impressions of their past year and their ideas about the future in the springtime sunlight of Wiltshire and Somerset, with Miss Seyffert acting the part of an almost ostentatiously discreet chorus, it was inevitable that their conversation should become, by imperceptible gradations, more personal and intimate. They kept up with the pose, which was supposed to represent Dr. Martineau's philosophy of being man and woman on their planet, considering its future, but insensibly they developed the idiosyncrasies of their position. They might profess to be man and woman in the most general terms, but the fact that she was the daughter, not of every man, but of old Grammont, and that Sir Richmond was the angry leader of a minority upon the Fuel Commission, became more and more important. What shall we do with this planet of ours? Gave way by the easiest transitions to what are you and I doing, and what have we got to do? How do you feel about it all? What do you desire, and what do you dare? It was natural that Sir Richmond should talk of his Fuel Commission to a young woman whose interests in fuel were even greater than his own. He found that she was very much a better reader than he was in the recent literature of socialism, and that she had what he considered to be a most unfeminine grasp of economic ideas. He thought her attitude towards socialism a very sane one because it was also his own. So far as socialism involved the idea of a scientific control of natural resources as a common property administered in the common interest, she and he were very greatly attracted by it, so far as it served as a form of expression for a merely insubordinate discontent of the many with the few, under any conditions, so long as it was a formula for class jealousy and warfare, they were both repelled by it. If she had had any illusions about the working class possessing as a class any profounder political wisdom or more generous public impulses than any other class, those illusions had long since departed. People were much the same, she thought, in every class. There was no stratification of either rightness or righteous. He found he could talk to her of his work and aims upon the Fuel Commission and of the conflict and failure of motives he found in himself as freely as he had done to Dr. Martineau, and with a surer confidence of understanding. Perhaps his talks with the doctor had got his ideas into order and made them more readily expressible than they would have been otherwise. He argued against the belief that any class could be good a class or as bad a class, and he instanced the conflict of motives he found in all the members of his committee, and most so in himself. He repeated the persuasion he had already confessed to Dr. Martineau, that there was not a single member of the Fuel Commission that but had a considerable drive towards doing the right thing about fuel, and not one who had a single-minded, unencumbered drive towards the right thing. That, said Sir Richmond, is what makes life so interesting and, in spite of 1,000 tragic disappointments, so hopeful. Every man is a bad man, every man is a feeble man, and every man is a good man. My motives come and go, yours do the same. We vary in response to the circumstances about us. Given a proper atmosphere, most men will be public spirited, right living, generous. Given perplexities and darkness, most of us can be cowardly and vile. People say you cannot change human nature, and perhaps that is true, but you can change its responses endlessly. The other day I was in Bohemia discussing Silesian coal with Venice, and I went to see the festival of the Bohemia Sokols. Opposite to where I sat, far away across the arena, was a great bank of men of the Sokol organizations, an unbroken brown mass wrapped in their brown uniform cloaks. Suddenly the sun came out, and at a word, the whole body flung back their cloaks, showed their Garibaldi shirts, and became one solid blaze of red. It was an amazing transformation until one understood what had happened. Yet nothing material had changed but the sunshine. And given any change in laws and prevailing ideas, and the very same people who are greedy traders, grasping owners, and revolting workers today will all throw their cloaks aside, and you will find them working together cheerfully, even generously, for a common end. There aren't traders and owners and workers and so forth by any inner necessity. Those are just the ugly parts they play in the present drama, which is nearly at the end of its run. That's a hopeful view, said Miss Grammont. I don't see the flaw in it, if there is a flaw. There isn't one, said Sir Richmond. It is my chief discovery about life. I began with the question of fuel and the energy it affords mankind, and I have found that my generalization applies to all human affairs. Human beings are fools, weaklings, cowards, passionate idiots, I grant you. That is the brown cloak side of them, so to speak. But they are not such fools and so forth that they can't do pretty well materially if once we hammer out a sane collective method of getting and using fuel, which people generally will understand, in the place of our present methods of snatch and wrangle. Of that I am absolutely convinced. Some work, some help, some willingness you can get out of everybody. That's the red. And the same principle applies to most labour and property problems, to health, to education, to population, social relationships, and war and peace. We haven't got the right system. We have inefficient, half-baked systems, or no system at all, and a wild confusion and war of ideas in all these respects. But there is a right system possible nonetheless. Let us only hammer our way through the sane and reasonable organization in this and that and the other human affairs, and once we have got it, we shall have got it for good. We may not live to see even the beginnings of success, but the spirit of order, the spirit that has already produced organized science, if only there are a few faithful, persistent people to stick to the job, will in the long run certainly save mankind and make human life clean and splendid, happy work in a clear mind, if I could live to see it. And as for us in our time, measured by the end we serve, we don't matter. You know we don't matter. We have to find our fun in the building and in our confidence that we do really build. So long as our confidence lasts, there is no great hardship, said Sir Richmond. So long as our confidence lasts, she repeated after him. Ah, cried Sir Richmond, there it is. So long as our confidence lasts, so long as one keeps one's mind steady. That is what I came away with Dr. Martineau to discuss. I went to him for advice. I haven't known him for more than a month. It's amusing to find myself preaching forth to you. It was just faith I had lost. Suddenly I had lost my power of work. My confidence in the rightness of what I was doing evaporated. My will failed me. I don't know if you will understand what that means. It wasn't that my reason didn't assure me just as certainly as ever that what I was trying to do was the right thing to try to do. But somehow that seemed a cold and personally unimportant proposition. The life had gone out of it. He paused as if arrested by a momentary doubt. I don't know why I tell you these things, he said. You tell them to me, she said. It's a little like a patient in a hydropath retailing his ailments. No, no, go on. I began to think now that what took the go out of me as my work went on was the lack of any real fellowship in what I was doing. It was the pressure of the opposition in the committee day after day. It was being up against men who didn't reason against me, but who just showed by everything they did that the things I wanted to achieve didn't matter to them one rap. It wasn't going back to a home, lunching in clubs, reading papers, going about a world in which all the organization, all the possibility of the organization I dream of is tacitly denied. I don't know if it seems an extraordinary confession of weakness to you, but that steady refusal of the majority of my committee to come into cooperation with me has beaten me, or at any rate has come very near to beating me. Most of them, are such able men. You can feel their knowledge and common sense. They and everybody about me seemed busy and intent upon more immediate things that seemed more real to them than this remote, theoretical, priggish end I have set for myself. He paused. Go on, said Miss Grammont. I think I understand this, and yet I know I am right. I know you are right. I'm certain. Go on. If one of those 10,000 members of the so-called society had thrown back his brown cloak and shown red when all the others still kept themselves cloaked, if he was a normal, sensitive man, he might have felt something of a fool. He might have felt premature and presumptuous. Red he was, and the others he knew were red also, but why show it? That is the peculiar distress of people like ourselves, who have some sense of history and some sense of a larger life within us than our merely personal life. We don't want to go on with the old story merely. We want to live somehow in that larger life and to live for its greater ends and lose something unbearable of ourselves. And in wanting to do that, we are only wanting to do what nearly everybody perhaps is ripe to do and will presently want to do. When the New Age Martineau talks about beginning to come, it may come very quickly, as the red came at Prague. But for the present, everyone hesitates about throwing back the cloak, until the cloak becomes unbearable, she said, repeating his word. I came upon this holiday in the queerest state. I thought I was ill. I thought I was overworked. But the real trouble was a loneliness that robbed me of all my driving force. Nobody seemed thinking and feeling with me. I have never realized until now what a gregarious beast man is. It needed only a day or so with Martineau, in the atmosphere of ideas and beliefs like my own, to begin my restoration. Now, as I talk to you, that is why I have clutched at your company, because here you are, coming from thousands of miles away, and you took my ideas, you fall into my ways of thought, as though we had gone to the same school. Perhaps we have gone to the same school, she said. You mean disappointment, disillusionment, having to find something better in life than the first things it promised us. But you, disappointed, I thought that in America people might be educating already on different lines. Even in America, Miss Grammont said, crops only grow on the ploughed land. Section 8. Glastonbury in the afternoon was wonderful. They talked of Avalon and of that vanished legendary world of King Arthur and his knights, and in the early evening they came to Wells and a pleasant inn, with a quaint little garden before its front door that gave directly upon the cathedral. The three tourists devoted a golden half-hour before dinner to the sculptures on the western face. The great screen of wrought stone rose up warmly, grey and clear and distinct against a clear blue sky in which the moon hung round and already bright. The western facade, with its hundreds of little figures, tells the whole story of God and man from Adam to the Last Judgment, as the medieval mind conceived it. it is an even fuller exposition than the carved Bible history that goes round the chapter house at Salisbury. It presented the universe and Sir Richmond as a complete crystal globe. It explained everything in life in a simple and natural manner: hope, heaven, devil, and despair. Generations had lived and died mentally within that crystal globe, convinced that it was all and complete. And now, said Miss Grammont, we are in limitless space and time. The crystal globe is broken. And, said Belinda, amazingly, for she had been silent for some time, the goldfish are on the floor, free to flop about. Are they any happier? It was one of those sudden rhetorical triumphs that are best left alone. I trow not, said Belinda, giving the last touch to it. After dinner, Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont walked round the cathedral and long by the moat of the bishop's palace, and Miss Seyffert stayed in the hotel to send off postcards to her friends, a duty she had neglected for some days. The evening was warm and still, and the moon was approaching, it being very full and very bright. Insensibly, the soft afterglow passed into moonlight. At first, the two companions talked very little. Sir Richmond was well content with this tacit friendliness, and Miss Grammont was preoccupied because she was very strongly moved to tell him things about herself that hitherto she had told to no one. It was not merely that she wanted to tell him these things, but also that for reasons she did not put as yet very clearly to herself, she thought they were things he ought to know. She talked of herself at first in general terms. Life comes on everyone with a rush. Childhood seems lasting forever, and then suddenly one tears into life, she said. It was even more so for women than it was for men. You are shown life, a crowded, vast spectacle full of what seems to be intensely interesting activities and endless delights and frightful and tragic possibilities, and you have hardly had time to look at it before you are called upon to make decisions. And there is something in your blood that urges you to decisive acts. Your mind, your reason resists. Give me time, it says. They clamour at you with treats, crowds, shows, theatres, all sorts of things. Lovers buzz at you, each trying to fix you part of his life when you are trying to get clear to live a little of your own. Her father had had one merit at any rate. He had been jealous of her lovers and very ready to interfere. I wanted a lover to love, she said. Every girl, of course, wants that. I wanted to be tremendously excited, and at the same time, I dreaded the enormous interference. I wasn't temperamentally a cold girl. Men interested and excited me, but there were a lot of men about and they clashed with each other. Perhaps way down in some out-of-the-way place I should have fallen in love quite easily with one man who came along, but no man fixed his image. After a year or so, I think, I began to lose the power which is natural to a young girl of falling very easily into love. I became critical of the youths and men who were attracted to me, and I became analytical about myself. I suppose it is because you and I are going to part so soon that I can speak so freely to you, but there are things about myself that I have never had out, even with myself. I can talk to myself in you. She paused, baffled. I know exactly, said Sir Richmond. In my composition, I perceive there have always been two ruling strains. I was a spoilt child at home, a rather reserved girl at school, keen on my dignity. I liked respect. I didn't give myself away. I suppose one would call that personal pride. Anyhow, it was that streak that made me value the position of being a rich married woman in New York. That was why I became engaged to Lake. He seemed to be as good a man as there was about. He said he adored me and wanted me to crown his life. He wasn't ill-looking or ill-mannered. The second main streak in my nature wouldn't, however, fit in with that. She stopped short. The second streak, said Sir Richmond. Oh, love of beauty, love of romance. I want to give things their proper names. I don't want to pretend to you. It was more or less than that. It was imaginative, sensuousness. Why should I pretend it wasn't in me? I believe that streak is in all women. I believe so too, in all properly constituted women. I tried to devote that streak to Lake, she said. I did my best for him, but Lake was much too much of a gentleman or an idealist about women, or what you will, to know his business as a lover. And that side of me fell in love, the rest of me protesting, with a man named Caston. Except when my father is about, his jealousy has blasted an area of silence. In that matter all round him, he will not know of that story, and they dare not tell him. I should pity anyone who tried to tell it to him. What sort of man was this Caston? Miss Grammont seemed to consider. She did not look at Sir Richmond. She kept her profile to him. He was, she said deliberately, a very rotten sort of man. She spoke like one resolved to be exact and judicial. I believe I always knew he wasn't right, but he was very handsome, and 10 years younger than Lake. Nobody else seemed to be all right, so I swallowed that. But he was an artist, a painter. Perhaps you know his work. Sir Richmond shook his head. He could make American businessmen look like characters out of the Three Musketeers, they said, and he was beginning to be popular. He made love to me, in exactly the way Lake didn't. If I shut my eyes to one or two things, it was delightful. I liked it. But my father would have stood a painter as my husband almost as cheerfully as he would a man of colour. I made a fool of myself, as people say, about Caston. Well, when the war came, he talked in a way that irritated me. He talked like an East Side annunzio about art and war. It made me furious to know it was all talk and that he didn't mean business. I made him go. She paused for a moment. He hated to go. Then I relented, or I missed him and I wanted to be made love to, or I really wanted to go on my own account. I forget my motives altogether now. That early wartime was a queer time for everyone. A kind of wildness got into the blood. I threw over Lake. All the time things had been going on in New York, I had still been engaged to Lake. I went to France. I did good work. I did do good work. And also things were possible that would have seemed fantastic in America. You know something of the wartime atmosphere. There was death everywhere and people snatched at gratifications. Caston made tomorrow we die his text. We contrived 3 days in Paris together, not very cleverly. All sorts of people know about it. We went very far. She stopped short. Well, said Sir Richmond. He did die. Another long pause. They told me Caston had been killed, but someone hinted, or I guessed, that there was more in it than an ordinary casualty. Nobody, I think, realizes that I know. This is the first time I have ever confessed that I do know. He was shot. He was shot for cowardice. That might happen to any man, said Sir Richmond presently. No man is all hero all round. The 24 hours. Perhaps he was caught by circumstances, unprepared. He may have been taken by surprise. It was the most calculated, cold-blooded cowardice imaginable. He let 3 other men go on and get killed. No, it is no good you inventing excuses for a man you know nothing about. It was vile, contemptible cowardice and meanness. It fitted in with a score of ugly little things I remembered. It explained them all. I know the evidence and the judgment against him were strictly just and true because they were exactly in character, and that, you see, was my man. That was the lover I had chosen. That was the man to whom I had given myself with both hands. Her soft, unhurrying voice halted for a time and then resumed in the same even tones of careful statement. I wasn't disgusted, not even with myself. About him I was chiefly sorry, intensely sorry, because I had made him come out of a life that suited and protected him to the war. About myself I was stunned and perplexed. I had the clearest realization that what you and I have been calling the bright little personal life had broken off short and was spoilt and over and done with. I felt as though it was my body they had shot, and there I was, with 50 years of life left in me and nothing particular to do with them. That was just the prelude to life, said Sir Richmond. It didn't seem so at the time. I felt I had to get hold of something or go to pieces. I couldn't turn to religion. I had no religion. And duty? What is duty? I set myself to that. I had a kind of revelation one night. Either I find out what all this world is about, I said, or I perish. I have lost myself and I must forget myself by getting hold of something bigger than myself and becoming that. That's why I have been making a sort of historical pilgrimage. That's my story, Sir Richmond. That's my education. Somehow, though your troubles are different, it seems to me that my little muddle makes me understand how it is with you. What you've got, this idea of a scientific ordering of the world, is what I, in my younger, less experienced way, have been feeling my way towards. I want to join on. I want to get hold of this idea of a great fuel control in the world and of a still greater economic and educational control of which it is a part. I want to make that idea a part of myself. Rather, I want to make myself a part of it. When you talk of it, I believe in it altogether, and I believe in it when I talk of it to you. Section 9. Sir Richmond was stirred very deeply by Miss Grammond's confidences. His dispute with Dr. Martineau was present in his mind, so that he did not want to make love to her, but he was extremely anxious to express his vivid sense of the value of her friendship. And while he hesitated over this difficult and unfamiliar task, she began to talk again of herself, and in such a way as to give a new turn to Sir Richmond's thoughts. Perhaps I ought to tell you a little more about myself, she said. Now that I have told you so much, I did a thing that still puzzles me. I was filled with a sense of hopeless disaster in France, and I suppose I had some sort of desperate idea of saving something out of the situation. I renewed my correspondence with Gunter Lake. He made the suggestion I knew he would make, and I renewed our engagement. To go back to wealth and dignity in New York? Yes, but you don't love him. That's always been plain to me, but what I didn't realize until I had given my promise over again was that I dislike him acutely. You hadn't realized that before? I hadn't thought about him sufficiently, but now I had to think about him a lot. The other affair had given me an idea, perhaps, of what it means to be married to a man, and here I am drifting back to him. The horrible thing about him is the steady, enveloping way in which he has always come at me, without fellowship, without any community of ideas, ready to make the most extraordinary bargains, so long as he can in any way fix me and get me. What does it mean? What is there behind those watching, soliciting eyes of his? I don't in the least love him, and this desire and service and all the rest of it he offers me, it's not love. It's not even such love as Caston gave me. It's a game he plays with his imagination. She had released a flood of new ideas in Sir Richmond's mind. This is illuminating, he said. You dislike Lake acutely. You always have disliked him. I suppose I have, but it's only now I admit it to myself. Yes, and you might, for example, have married him in New York before the war. It came very near to that. And then probably you wouldn't have discovered you disliked him. You wouldn't have admitted it to yourself. I suppose I shouldn't. I suppose I should have tried to believe I loved him. Women do this sort of thing. Odd, I never realized it before. And there are endless wives suppressing an acute dislike. My wife does. I see now quite clearly that she detests me. Reasonably enough. From her angle, I am entirely detestable. But she won't admit it, won't know of it. She never will. To the end of my life, always. She will keep that detestation unconfessed. She puts a face on the matter. We both do. And this affair of yours, have you thought how unjust it is to Lake? Not nearly so much as I might have done. It is unfair to him. Atrociously unfair. He's not my sort of man, perhaps, but it will hurt him cruelly according to the peculiar laws of his being. He seems to me a crawling sort of lover with an immense self-conceit at the back of his crawlingness. He has, she endorsed. He backs himself to crawl until he crawls triumphantly right over you. I don't like to think of the dream he has. I take it he will lose. Is it fair to go into this game with him? In the interests of Lake, she said, smiling softly at Sir Richmond in the moonlight, but you are perfectly right, and suppose he doesn't lose. Sir Richmond found himself uttering sentiments. There is only one deceit way in which a civilized man and a civilized woman may approach one another. Passionate desire is not enough. What is called love is not enough. Pledges, rational considerations, all these things are worthless. All these things are compatible with hate. The primary essential is friendship, clear understanding, absolute confidence. Then, within that condition, in that elect relationship, love is permissible. Mating, marriage or no marriage, as you will, all things are permissible. Came a long pause between them. Dear old cathedral, said Miss Grammont, a little irrelevantly. She had an air of having concluded something that, to Sir Richmond, seemed scarcely to have begun. She stood looking at the great dark facade edged with moonlight for some moments, and then turned towards the hotel, which showed a pink-lit window. I wonder, she said, if Belinda is still up, and what she will think when I tell her of the final extinction of Mr. Lake. I think she rather looked forward to being the intimate friend, secrets and everything, of Mrs. Gunter Lake. Section 10. Sir Richmond woke up at dawn, and he woke out of an extraordinary dream. He was saying to Mrs. Grammont, there is no other marriage than the marriage of true minds. He saw her as he had seen her the evening before, light and cool, coming towards him in the moonlight from the hotel, but also in the inconsistent way of dreams he was very close to her kind, faintly smiling face, and his eyes were wet with tears, and he was kissing her hand. My dear wife and mate, he was saying, and suddenly he was kissing her cool lips. He woke up and stared at his dream, which faded out only very slowly before the fresh sunrise upon the red tiles and tree boughs outside the open window, and before the first stir and clamour of the birds. He felt like a court in which some overwhelmingly revolutionary piece of evidence had been tendered. All the elaborate defence had broken down at one blow. He sat up on the edge of his bed, facing the new fact. This is monstrous and ridiculous, he said. And Martineau judged me exactly. I am in love with her. I am head over heels in love with her. I have never been so much in love or so truly in love with anyone before. Section 11. That was the dawn of a long day of tension for Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont, because each was now vividly aware of being in love with the other, and so neither was able to see how things were with the other. They were afraid of each other. A restraint had come upon them both, a restraint that was greatly enhanced by their sense of Belinda, acutely observant, ostentatiously tactful and self-effacing, and prepared at the slightest encouragement to be overwhelmingly romantic and sympathetic. Their talk waned and was revived to an artificial activity and waned again. The historical interest had evaporated from the west of England and left only an urgent and embarrassing present. But the loveliness of the weather did not fail, and the whole day was set in Severn landscapes. They first saw the great river like a sea with the Welsh mountains hanging in the sky behind as they came over the Mendip crest above Shipman. They saw it again as they crossed the hill before Clifton Bridge, and so they continued climbing to hill crests for views of Alveston and near Dursley, and so to Gloucester and the lowest bridge, and thence back downstream again through fat meadow lands, at first much apple blossom, and then over gentle hills through wide, pale Nonham and Lindney and Alvington and Wollaston and Old Cheapstow and its brown castle, always with the widening estuary to the left of them, and its foaming shoals and shining sandbanks. From Cheapstow, they turned back north the steep Wye Gorge to Tintern, and there, at the snug little Beaufort Arms, with its prim lawn and flower garden, they ended the day's journey. Tintern Abbey they thought a poor graceless mass of ruin down beside the river, and it was fenced about jealously and locked up from their invasion. After dinner, Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont went for a walk in the mingled twilight and moonlight up the hill towards Cheapstow. Both of them were absurdly and nervously pressing to Belinda to come with them, but she was far too wise to take this sudden desire for her company seriously. Her dinner shoes, she said, were too thin. Perhaps she would change and come out a little later. Yes, come later, said Miss Grammont, and led the way to the door. They passed through the garden. I think we go up the hill, said Sir Richmond. Yes, she agreed. Up the hill. Followed a silence. Sir Richmond made an effort, but after some artificial and disconnected talk about Tintern Abbey, concerning which she had no history ready, and then still lamer, about whether Monmouthshire is in England or Wales, silence fell again. The silence lengthened, assumed a significance, a dignity that no common words might break. Then Sir Richmond spoke. I love you, he said, with all my heart. Her soft voice came back after a stillness. I love you, she said, with all myself. I had long ceased to hope, said Sir Richmond, that I should ever find a friend, a lover, a perfect companionship. They went on walking side by side without touching each other or turning to each other. All the things I wanted to think I believe have come alive in me, she said. Cool and sweet, said Sir Richmond, such happiness as I could not have imagined. The light of a silent bicycle appeared above them up the hill and swept down upon them, lit their two still faces brightly, and passed. My dear, she whispered in the darkness between the high hedges. They stopped short and stood quite still, trembling. He saw her face, dim and tender, looking up to his. Then he took her in his arms and kissed her lips as he had desired in his dream. When they returned to the inn, Belinda Seyffert offered flat explanations of why she had not followed them, and enlarged upon the moonlight effect of the Abbey ruins from the inn lawn. But the sacred congratulations in her eyes betrayed her recognition that momentous things had happened between the two. Chapter 8 Full Moon, Section 1. Sir Richmond had talked in the moonlight and shadows of having found such happiness as he could not have imagined, but when he awoke in the night, that happiness had evaporated. He awoke suddenly out of this love dream that had lasted now for nearly 4 days, and he awoke in a mood of astonishment and dismay. He had thought that when he parted from Dr. Martineau, he had parted also from that process of self-exploration that they had started together, but now he awakened to find it established and in full activity in his mind. Something or someone, a sort of etherealized Martineau Hardy, an abstracted intellectual conscience, was demanding what he thought he was doing with Miss Grammont, and whither he thought he was taking her, how he proposed to reconcile the close relationship with her that he was now embarked upon, in the first place his work upon, and engagements with the Fuel Commission, and in the second place Martin Leeds. Curiously enough, Lady Hardy didn't come into the case at all. He had done his utmost to keep Martin Leeds out of his head throughout the development of this affair. Now, in an unruly and determined way that was extremely characteristic of her, she seemed resolute to break in. She appeared as an advocate without affection for her client, but without any hostility, of the claims of Miss Grammont to be let alone. The elaborate pretense that Sir Richmond had maintained to himself that he had not made love to Miss Grammont, that their mutual attraction had been irresistible and had achieved its end in spite of their resolute and complete detachment, collapsed and vanished from his mind. He admitted to himself that, driven by a kind of instinctively necessity, he had led their conversation, step by step, to a realization and declaration of love, and that it did not exonerate him in the least that Miss Grammont had been quite ready and willing to help him and meet him halfway. She wanted love as a woman does, more than a man does, and he had steadily presented himself as a man free to love, able to love, and loving. She wanted a man to love, she wanted perfected fellowship, and you have made her that tremendous promise. That was implicit in your embrace, and how can you keep that promise? It was as if Martin spoke. It was her voice. It was the very quality of her thought. You belong to this work of yours, which needs to be interrupted or abandoned if you take her. Whatever, it is not mortgaged to your work, is mortgaged to me. For the strange thing in all this is that you and I love one another, and no power to do otherwise, in spite of all this. You have nothing to give her but stolen goods, said the shadow of Martin. You have nothing to give anyone personally any more. Think of the love that she desires and think of this love that you can give. Is there any new thing in you that you can give her that you haven't given to me? You and I know each other very well. Perhaps I know you too well. Haven't you loved me as much as you can love anyone? Think of all that there has been between us, that you are ready now, eager now to set aside and forget as though it never had been. For 4 days you have kept me out of your mind in order to worship her, yet you have known I was there, for all you would not know. No one else will ever be so intimate with you as I am. We have quarrelled together, wept together, jested happily and jested bitterly. You have spared me not at all. Pitiless and cruel you have been to me. You have reckoned up all my faults against me as though they were sins. You have treated me at times unlovingly. Never was a lover treated so unlovingly as you have sometimes treated me, and yet I have your love, as no other woman can ever have it. Even now, when you are wildly in love with this girl's freshness and boldness and cleverness, I come into your mind by right and necessity. She is different, argued Sir Richmond. But you are the same, said the shadow of Martin, with Martin's unsparing return. Your love has never been a steadfast thing. It comes and goes like the wind. You are an extravagantly imperfect lover. But I have learned to accept you as people accept the English weather. Never in all your life have you loved wholly, fully, steadfastly, as people deserve to be loved. Not your mother, nor your father, nor your wife, nor your children, nor me, nor our child, nor any living thing. Pleasant to all of us at times bitterly disappointing. You do not even love this work of yours steadfastly, this work to which you sacrifice us all in turn. You do not love enough. That is why you have these moods and changes. That is why you have these lassitudes. So it is you are made. And why is it you must not take this brave young life, so much simpler and braver than your own, and exalt it as you can do, and then fail it, as you will do? Sir Richmond's mind and body lay very still for a time. Should I fail her? For a time Martin Leeds passed from the foreground of his mind. He was astonished to think how planless, instinctive, and unforeseeing his treatment of Miss Grammont had been. It had been just a blind drive to get hold of her and possess her. Suddenly his passion for her became active in its defense again. But is there such thing as a perfect love? Is yours a perfect love, my dear Martin, with its insatiable jealousy, its ruthless criticism? Has the world ever seen a perfect lover yet? Isn't it our imperfection that brings us together in a common need? Is Miss Grammont, after all, likely to get a more perfect love in all her life than this poor love of mine? And isn't it good for her that she should love? Perfect love cherishes, perfect love forgoes. Sir Richmond found his mind wandering far away from the immediate question. Perfect love, The phrase was his point of departure. Was it true that he could not love passionately and completely? Was that fundamentally what was the matter with him? Was that perhaps what was the matter with the whole world of mankind? It had not yet come to the power of loving which makes action full and simple and direct and unhesitating. Man upon his planet has not grown up to love, is still an eager, egotistical, and fluctuating adolescent. He lacks the courage to love and the wisdom to love. Love is here, but it comes and goes. It is mixed with greeds and jealousies and cowardice and cowardly reservations. One hears it only in snatches and single notes. It is like something turning up before the music begins. The metaphor altogether ran away with Sir Richmond's half-dreaming mind. Someday, perhaps, all life would go to music. Love was music and power. If he had loved enough, he need never have drifted away from his wife. Love would have created love, would have tolerated and taught and inspired. Where there is perfect love, there is neither greed nor impatience. He would have done his work calmly. He would have won his way with his committee instead of fighting and quarrelling with it perpetually. Flimsy creatures, he whispered, uncertain health, uncertain strength. A will that comes and goes, moods of baseness, moods of utter beastliness. Love like April sunshine. April? He dozed and dreamt for a time of spring passing into a high summer sunshine, into a continuing music of love. He thought of a world like some great playhouse in which players and orchestra and audience all cooperate in a noble production without dissent or conflict. He thought he was the savage of 30,000 years ago, dreaming of the great world that is still perhaps 30,000 years ahead. His effort to see more of that coming world than indistinct and cloudy pinnacles, and to hear more than a vague music, dissolved his dream and left him awake again and wrestling with the problem of Miss Grammont. Section 2. The shadow of Martin stood over him, inexorable. He had to release Miss Grammont from the adventure into which he had drawn her. This decision stood out stern and inevitable in his mind, with no conceivable alternative. As he looked at the task before him, he began to realize its difficulty. He was profoundly in love with her. He was still only learning how deeply, and she was not going to play a mere passive part in this affair. She was perhaps as deeply in love with him. He could not bring himself to the idea